The medbay hums with the soft whir of nanobots. Holographic monitors project vital signs and sleek surfaces reflect the sterile glow of blue lights. A droid nurse moves with precision as it preps tools on a floating tray. On the medical bed lies Corporal Ada, her military uniform torn and stained with blood. Her breathing is shallow but steady. Beside her, Dr. Kai works with quiet urgency. She's in her mid-40s, wearing a sleek lab coat with glowing seams, adjusting a portable med scanner over the abdomen of Corporal Ada, her jaw tight with focus. As she works, she brushes her hand across Ada's forehead, pushing aside that stubborn cowlick. The droid nurse hands her an injector. "What's in this injection, Nursebot?" "As requested, Doctor, but against my mainframe's advice, I am required by galactic law to inform you that this is pure, unadulterated Realms Unknown." Welcome to Realms Unknown. I'm your host, Alice Fraser, and once a week for about half of one of your human hours, I and a companion will journey through everything in the realms of speculative fiction, sci-fi, genre, fantasy, and more, from iconic literary fiction to games to the latest television shows. It's a space-based size download of the genres we love into your brain every week. Our guest for this week's episode of Realms Unknown is Tom Neenan. Hello, Tom. How are you going?
I'm very good. Greetings, weary traveller. I am here to share things that I have been catching up on in the world of sci-fi and fantasy. I'm not going to lie, mainly from my point of view, sci-fi. I'm here to be educated about fantasy, and hopefully as we go on this journey together, you will see me grow and develop my love for that genre further, because I am open to it. I just have not been educated well enough.
I mean, what about fantasy doesn't attract you? I guess is so we've got to begin. We've got to begin at the beginning. Maybe the mission for this podcast is to get you really into fantasy. What do you like about sci-fi that you don't like about fantasy? Because for me, they are sort of different flavors of the same delicious treat.
I think so, and I do like fantasy. Behind me is my map of Middle-earth. And I do like fantasy. I think I haven't given it the time. I haven't opened my heart to it in my life. But I'm there. I've read 3 of the Game of Thrones books and really enjoyed those. And I'm looking for more, and I'm looking for recommendations. So yeah, I just want to be upfront straight away that I might not be as conversant in that area of things. But please keep listening, because I have some opinions, and as a white man, they must be listened to.
Well, this episode 2, we're going to be going back into the past of the things that you have enjoyed that may be coming up in the future. Much as in Lord of the Rings, there's a Lothlorien, a place of comfort and security in which our hero can gather his strength and heart and set forth refreshed in purpose and renewed in vigor. So too will our weekly podcast take a moment each fortnight or so to look at the classics. I mean, I feel like it's too often that we're blinded by the bedazzlement of the new, and we don't take time to look back at the track that led us here, to be comforted by the bedazzlement of the old. So this episode, we're going to be looking at the classics, even in the news segment.
First of all, can I just talk about Lothlorien? Because I have issues with Lothlorien, which is so Frodo goes to Lothlorien after he's injured at Weathertop, right? That's like, so he goes there to recuperate. At the end of the films, he's there and he's injured and he's nursing the wound he got at Weathertop, saying it's never quite healed. I think the people of Lothlorien are hacks. I think they are quacks. I think he went there to get better. They did a bad job and it got infected. Something happened. Either way, they discharged him well before he should have been discharged. And that led to health complications down the road, which meant that he had to go to the Grey Havens well earlier than he should have done, because we know how long hobbits can live. So anyway, that's just... I've got a thing about the people who are sort of shills of big Lothlorien. I want to have it out with them straight away. So I guess that's what I'm angry about this week, is about Big Pharma or Small Farmer, because he's a small farmer, because he's a hobbit, and Big Lothlorien.
But I feel like, maybe it's a bit like we used to have a physio who was a runner in the running squad, and he would say, you go to a normal physio and the physio says, stay off your feet for 6 weeks or whatever, wear a foot, a boot and a crutch. And Chris would say, when are you going to start running again? And then he'd give you the advice.
Yeah.
To that, maybe just the Lothlorien medics are a little bit practical about quest-based logistics. They're like, obviously
Maybe.
you need to recuperate for 2 to 4 years, but when are you
I
going
reckon they're
to
like
be?
Michael Jackson's doctor. I think they're like, you need to be doing a tour right now. What can we give you? What can we pop you full of that means that basically you're upright for the next 24 hours?
Just chug 3 Lembas and you'll be fine.
Exactly.
So I have a friend, Dave, who was dog sitting, and he accidentally left the cupboard open to the dog food, and it was a golden retriever, and it ate way too much of the dog food. And when my friend Dave came home, he let the dog out into the yard, and the dog just walked around the yard abashedly doing the longest poo you've ever imagined. Really, really ashamed of himself. I feel like that's what it would happen if you ate 3 lambasses, because they're like 3 days worth of food.
Definitely. That's the one thing that Tolkien talks about everything, different languages. He never discussed that element of their travels.
Yeah. The famous Elven song, shitting your way down the track.
So that's what I've been thinking about this week.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's pretty good. I have been thinking back to some of the old books that kind of brought me here, and specifically sort of Robin Hobb and the her Fitz series, Fitz and the Fool. And I used to find, I think I had a love-hate relationship with those books, and I would end every book thinking, ugh, because I don't know, Robin Hobb had this habit of finishing the book where your narrator Fitz would be like, and then I was a broken man. I was, twitching with the poison, and I was too old to do anything good. And the next book would open with him being like, actually, I was 19 and had a slight limp. I was fine. And then he gets the shit beaten out of him for a whole nother book. And at the end, he's like, oh, I'm just completely destroyed and no one will ever love me again. And then the next book again, it's not that he's fine, but he's just so much better than he thought he was. Because she needs, she needs scope to beat the shit out of him again.
I love it.
Yeah, I think it's sort of an abusive relationship, because I don't, I'm quite a hopeful and positive person. I don't love it when they end defeated. I'm not a Grimdark fan, really.
Yes, yeah. I know, it's that's almost, I mean, that could be a discussion for another episode. It's like, the stories which end on such a like, oh, the world that we've occupied has no redeeming features. It's awful and it's inescapable. That feels like more of a sci-fi thing than a fantasy thing. I think there's maybe inherently a bit more optimism in fantasy, whereas like sci-fi love the thing where they like, so many Black Mirrors end with like, and that's what society is now, and isn't that awful? And just sort of lets you think about that for a bit. That meme of the sort of a parody of 70s sci-fi, which is the spaceman looking at the Earth going, oh my God, it's all something. And then the spaceman behind him with a gun going, it always has been. That just feels like the absolute, zenith of 70s sci-fi, which is like, it's all a conspiracy and you're a cog in the machine and you'll never escape kind of thing.
I mean, I've got to take back my thing of not enjoying Grimdark. I think because I really enjoyed Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence, where it's really horrible and depressing and all the characters are like truly morally horrendous, but it's actually got quite a hopeful and uplifting ending where they destroy the world, but in a good way.
Well, one of my favorite horror horror movies ever is Cabin in the Woods, sort of, reputation of the writer notwithstanding, and that has a very don't want to spoil too much, but it's a very bleak ending to that one. But because it sort of it's such an abrupt ending, I always think of it as quite a fun film rather than sort of incredibly bleak as it is. Yeah,
but also, that's what we have fan fiction for. If you don't enjoy the ending, I guarantee you there's 1,000 other people who have written a different and way more pornographic ending.
Yeah. God bless fanfic writers.
And that brings us to our ad section for today, because you can't be what you can't imagine. And this episode of the podcast is brought to you by futuristic home fit out for the corporate oligarch, by new app-enabled Bluetooth AI light bulbs so you never need to flip a light switch again. Instead, you can stand cursing in the dark while your phone fails to connect to the system, and wake screaming in the night when the AI decides you should be awake. Buy a new lounge room assortment. Choose looks over comfort because you're a billionaire, and let's be frank, you only use it for publicity images, and when your spouse cheats on you because you're never home, it might as well be on an uncomfortable couch. And this episode of the podcast is brought to you by that thing where a heroine brought up in a family and culture that is specific in its cultural restrictions has an ineffable and internal knowledge of the rights and entitlements of women that accord exactly with our own planet. Yes, you're brought up in a family that owns slaves, but somehow you know that's wrong, and also you want to be a doctor and not marry that old man.
This episode is brought to you by Elixirs. Elixirs, one size fits all. Feeling slightly under the weather or just one breath away from death? Why not try Elixirs? Can be taken either with bathing or orally ingested, and usually taste awful, but are delivered via a conch shell or large leaf. Elixirs, don't die yet.
And if you've got a bad taste in your mouth from your elixir, try half a glass of water. We are so good at this, Tom. Come on. And that brings us to what we have been into of late. Tom, what not new stuff have you been enjoying?
Right. It had to get mentioned at some point, and I've actually held off until now, and you should all be pleased. But what's wonderful about being a Doctor Who fan, and especially a classic Doctor Who fan, is actually you have access to 100 different genres at any time. And so I dip in regularly I try and find random stories, not particular seasons, not particular eras, but just a random story that I can dip into. And so I have just been enjoying, and this is for people who maybe enjoy like the fantasy realm more. There's a Tom Baker story called The Androids of Tara, which is based on The Prisoner of Zenda. And is sort of set in a very sort of genteel, I guess it would kind of be Mediterranean looking planet, where that has lots of kind of fantasy tropes. There's like this weird woodland beast, and it's so joyful and summery at a time when it's very dark and cold here. I would say that's well worth checking out. If you haven't seen any classic Doctor Who, it's charming, it's funny, it's witty, and yeah, it was a lovely chance to dip back into that. I highly recommend it.
I mean, that sounds amazing. I've not seen that, but I have read The Prisoner of Zenda. I also recommend, as another branch off of The Prisoner of Zenda, The Henchmen of Zenda by K.J. Charles, which is the story of the henchmen in the story of The Prisoner of Zenda, and it's like a love story between some of these guys, and I'm not going to spoil which of the guys end up together, but it's a really well-written book, and sort of all of K.J. Charles's stuff is taking on particularly historical fiction and doing a new, often sort of queer take on the tropes of
Mate, is
of,
it?
of
So
that.
it's like sort of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, but for The Prisoner of Zenda.
And with fucking, yes.
Yeah. Okay, what's that called again? Sorry, I will re-listen to this podcast.
It's called The Henchmen of Zenda.
Oh,
by
of course,
K.J.
yes, right,
Charles.
okay.
Yeah, and it's sort of, if you've read The Prisoner of Zenda, it's one of those ones that sort of is made better by having read The Prisoner of Zenda, but it actually works if you haven't read The Prisoner of Zenda as well.
Fantastic.
I'm going to make that my recent, although it's not so recent, I'm going to put that in this section anyway, because I feel like this section should be The Prisoner of Zenda. Go back and read it.
Shout out to The Prisoner of Zenda. Getting a lot of shout outs.
Yeah, Prisoner of Zenda, just sort of one of those books that you probably won't enjoy it that much, but part of what you won't enjoy about it is so many other things have copied it since.
Yes, exactly.
That it'll feel
and I was
really
lucky
familiar.
enough to be introduced to it. via a play that I saw. I think it was at the Greenwich Theatre years and years ago. Because obviously the fun thing is The Prisoner of Zenda is a bit like Tale of Two Cities. It's got the kind of the dual rolling thing. So yeah, it had two actors who played the same role, and it was very cleverly done the way it did that. But yeah, that's how I was introduced. And then I read the book, and I really enjoyed it. So yeah, wow! Shout out to when was The Prisoner of Zenda written? Whoa, 1894. It's not even like a significant celebration. Let's just shout out to this old book. It's brilliant. It is very good.
No one will benefit thereby, and also it doesn't matter whether the author was a good person or not, because they're definitely
exactly.
And
fill your boots.
If they happen to not be dead, I feel like time has washed away all sins. You know, they'd be like 140 now.
Exactly. Is it public domain now? Can you have like The Prisoner of Zenda fighting like Steamboat Willie in your own fan film?
Well, I imagine that was why KJ Charles got away with just writing The Henchmen of Zenda without having to,
yes, true.
Pay copyright to some 1890s publishing house.
Yeah.
And that brings me to Trope on a Rope, which is our recurring segment where we talk about a trope in the fiction that we enjoy, and whether sometimes it gets to be too much or whether it's just the right amount. Tom, what's your trope for this week?
I'm starting with a classic. This feels like one that people discuss a lot. And to the extent it has its own name, which is Born Sexy Yesterday, which is sort of the trope of a creature or a being who, usually female, who is created from nothing and sort of immediately has this sort of has the aura of a child while having the body and sort of sensuality of an adult. It's an uncomfortable combination. If you want to conjure some ideas, think about The Fifth Element. Think about Mila Jovovich in The Fifth Element. That's certainly got that sort of element to it. Not quite sort of as literal, but also things like, I guess, Mantis in Guardians of the Galaxy has kind of a she's lived like a sheltered life, and she takes on sort of very infantile sort of perspective on the world while also sort of being played by an attractive actor. And so sort of that combines it. And this was a genre that was taken to, I think it's apex in last year's was it called? Hang on, sorry, I had it in my mind. Is it called Hot Frosty? Am I right in thinking it's called Hot Frosty, which is the woman makes sexy snowman and sexy snowman comes to life and has this incredible body and is nude and also is a minute old. So like, it's almost like people are now aware of that trope and are playing with it slightly more. That feels like Hot Frosty feels like it's at least conversant in sort of the meta discussion it's having about that. But yeah, it's also
certainly traditionally that's a female role, and it seems to be more sort of problematic when it is a female role because of the idea of sort of women's innocence and like all of that like stuff. But I do feel like there's also a time-honored tradition of the hot himbo baby boy that I think really kind of got its teeth in around Brendan Fraser in that those movies where he was like George of the Jungle, and then the Neanderthal that got dug up from this, and like just where I think that was a real stride forward for feminism, those movies. I think
it was, and I forget as well, Brendan Fraser was also in Blast from the Past, which, while not Born Sexy Yesterday, Blast from the Past is where he's been since the 50s, has been in a bomb shelter and is sort of released into the 90s as a grown man. And so sort of has childlike or sort of naive perspectives on the world while also being very attractive. Yeah, Brendan Fraser, I hadn't thought about this. He's very much he's the poster boy for the male version of Born Sexy Yesterday, isn't he?
Yeah, but I think they're sort of doing different things in society, if you know what I mean. So that with the female version of Born Sexy Yesterday, it's sort of playing into sort of ideas that women are better if they're malleable, and that they're more attractive to you.
Right, yes.
They're more attractive to you.
Your camera's throwing shade at you there by zooming in on you.
The more unsophisticated they are, the more attractive they are to some degree, and that's got to do with ideas of like male power and control over a woman who might be smart but will use it in your service and is sublimated to you. Whereas I think the Born Sexy Yesterday trope for men, the kind of underlying story that it's telling, the sexy story that it's telling to women is like, what if there was a guy but he hadn't been socialized to be toxic?
Yes, exactly.
And you could just be like, he's never going to be DJ Khaleding you about head. He'll be like, sounds great, let's do it. Tell me how. And just,
Yeah. It's the man with the brain of a dog, I think, which is sort of the perfect man in a sense. Also, because I have to bring everything back to Doctor Who, I guess Leela, who's like a savage that the Doctor sort of takes on in a kind of Pygmalion role, played by Louise Jameson, what they cleverly do, the good writing for that always gives her agency and always gives her an intelligence. It's just not the kind of socialized intelligence. It's more kind of instinctual intelligence. So there are riffs on the Born Sexy Yesterday, which can be still empowering, I guess, but aren't the full version. I just wanted to mention that in case people thought, hang on, you mentioned 70s Tom Baker era Doctor Who, but you ignored this. I've done it now, guys. It's fine.
Thank you very much for that trope, Tom. My trope is sort of an orthogonal line off yours, which is first contact, put your dick in it. And like, this is very probably Star Trek specific, an early Kirk specific, but I do think it has permeated a fair few other avenues of exploration, particularly in sci-fi, that you will meet an alien species. We, a species that is like historically known for our interspecies xenophobia. That the first thing we're going to do is when we meet an alien is not be like, uncanny valley. It's like, want to have a cup of something that's not poisonous to both of us? Like,
I think my favorite example of this, because it's calling out the weirdness, is Galaxy Quest, where is it Tony Shalhoub and Missy Pyle? They sort of spark up a relationship, and while both of them are humanoid, as soon as they start other things, Missy Pyle becomes like a tentacled weirdo, and it's sort of called out how disgusting that would be.
And that's trope on a rope. Now this brings me to convince me to read this book, which is the section where a listener who has emailed us at realmsunknown@thebuglepodcast.com will send in a voice note that will convince me to read a book. Our listener this week is Tom, but not you, Tom, another Tom. What have you got for us, Tom?
Okay, so a book I would recommend is called The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. It's one of my favourite science fiction books of all time. And Ursula Le Guin is one of the absolute masters of sci-fi and fantasy. And why I would recommend it, it's one of those sci-fi books that, like all good sci-fi books, it offers an amazing escape. It paints the picture of this anarchist world where life is handled in a completely different way to our current society. And it's Ursula's exploration of what that world might look like. But like all great sci-fi, it also holds a mirror up to our own society and reflects back at us some of the things that we could learn. So highly recommend this book to you. Hope you enjoy it.
Thank you, Tom. I have read The Dispossessed. I don't know if that means you win or you lose. We'll have to decide on what the point system is. Yes, I second that recommendation. If you have not read The Dispossessed, it is just a fantastic read. I feel like Ursula Le Guin's books are always just never going to be the wrong thing to read. But yeah, I'm not going to start prescribing you fantasy books until I have a a stronger sense of what would be good. I feel like I should offer a service of like diagnosis and prescription of what fantasy you might like. But I need more data points on that one.
And listeners as well, you can find me on Blue Sky. I'm open to recommendations. I'm on a journey here, guys, and we're all going on it together.
Yep, I'm hoping that this I'm hoping that this podcast will fill your TBR piles, your to be read books.
Definitely,
because I don't know. Does anyone else enjoy that? Just having a whole lot of things that are going to be great lined up. I think it's the antidote to algorithms, is having people tell you great stuff.
I've just started reading Out There Screaming, which is a combination of a collection of short stories, particularly Black horror writers, and it's compiled by Jordan Peele, and it's like a mini version of like a big pile of writing, because I've read the first like 4 and I'm really enjoying them, and I know I've got all these short stories to come, and it's like a mini version of that, where I just know I've got all these like lovely stories piled up, because I've really enjoyed the ones that I've read so far. That's a recommendation for Out There Screaming.
And that brings us to the section, The Minds of which is where we rank an old piece of media that we loved with our modern eyes, and between 1, which is like, and 10, which is, you wouldn't read it now. Tom, what's your for this week?
So my is a film I absolutely adored and would still defend to a certain degree, which is called Cube. If you know anything about Cube, which is a sci-fi film from I think 97, sorry, and it features a character in the reason that it features. But basically, if you don't know Cube, it's basically set in a giant cube, and you go into, and within it are different other cubes, a bit like a Rubik's Cube. And as you enter them, there might be a deadly trap, or it might be safe, and it's people navigating this. Basically, it's a super low budget Canadian sci-fi horror film. And it deals a lot with archetypes. It's almost like an episode of The Twilight Zone. And sadly, one of the archetypes it has from this film, 1997, like I say, is a character called Kazan, who represents a form of autism, sort of a savant autism, which certainly is how it was portrayed back then. It's portrayed by an actor called Andrew Miller, who doesn't have autism, and as far as I'm aware, is sort of neurotypical. And there's a lot of discussion I've been reading online, various very good blogs and things, which I guess we could sort of link to, about the portrayal of this character, who the writer-director, Vincenzo Natali, I read one article where he sort of talks about how this character isn't really discussed as a character at all. And at one point it says is more like a pocket calculator with regard to his mechanics in the plot. And I really like Cube. Cube's like a really interesting sci-fi film, but you look back on it now and you realise that, yes, basically there's this character whose job it is to sort of work out how to navigate the cube using sort of, I guess, factors of prime numbers. I'm not going to pretend to understand the maths, but it's interesting, and the way the character is certainly... it's sort of infantilized, and it sort of gets them in more danger than is helpful, and is sort of mistreated, and it's not atrocious. I can't talk to it. I'm not an autist, so I can't speak to sort of how that kind of portrayal affects me. But you look at it now and you go, this wouldn't be this trope, this kind of slightly post Rain Man idea about what this savantism has aged quite badly, I think, even though I like it. But then, I guess your temperature may vary on how much that affects you. So I don't know how I would rank the necessarily, but I'd be interested to know how, other listeners and maybe people more affected by it might rank it.
If you have opinions about this, we can tell Tom how you feel, if this film stands up to time. How is it out of 10? By emailing us at realmsunknown@thebuglepodcast.com.
Please. I'd be interested to know what people think. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know what people think as well, because I couldn't watch that. I think in the very first sequence, somebody walks through a fine wire mesh and gets chopped into tiny little cubes. The cubes within the
Yes.
cube, and that was it. That was the end of the movie for me. What a short movie that was! Just I could not get past that one. So not for me. That was right in that first 2 seconds for me.
Yeah.
My minds of is I've mentioned before that I've been looking back at the Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, which is a very, very big series of books in which you have it's sort of sci-fi premise but fantasy, and the books range between sci-fi and fantasy. It's a colonized planet. They land on the planet. They try to begin a colony, and they realize there's a seasonal sort of satellite moon that comes by, and when it's in the orbit, once every 20 years, it will drop this stuff called thread. Once every 200 years, it'll drop this stuff called thread, which is sort of a ravenous kind of non-sentient worm fungus thing that just eats everything alive, and including people and all organic matter. And as a result, they take the local fauna, which are small dragonettes who have some they take the local fauna, which are small dragons that have some minor psychic abilities, and they genetically engineer them to become massive dragons for fighting the thread. And then the whole sort of society and culture emerges from these different pressures, which is every 200 years, unless you're on stone or inside some non-organic structure, everyone gets eaten, and everything that everyone owns gets eaten. And so you have a fairly medieval society that's built on top of these genetically engineered dragon creatures, who also do things like going into heat cycles and bonding with humans. So if you're bonded to a dragon and it goes into a heat cycle, you basically have to bang whoever's closest. Or maybe you have to bang the person who's attached to their dragon. As a teenager, it was great. It's so fun. It's like rollicking. It's very melodramatic. It's very exciting. It does, bits of it do not stand up to the modern sensibility. I mean, everyone is incredibly beautiful. Often you have it's a high-handed society where if you bond to a dragon, you become part of a essentially dominant aristocratic class that then taxes the lower people and sort of deserves everything they get. It's also extremely not great about gay people. And Anne McCaffrey quite famously and scandalously said she thought that if you ever had butt sex, that made you gay, and that she had written books with that knowledge because a friend of hers had had butt sex and it had made him gay. And so obviously that she was writing from a point of naivety, and she said that from a point of naivety, but it certainly does colour the dealings with sex in the book as being from like a very particular POV, which was like maybe a very sheltered one. So I think in terms of like between 1 being and 10 being I would say it's like a 5.5. It's still really fun, but you can't read it like it's good.
Yeah.
You know?
So hang on, if you did that, if you were a male and you did that with a woman, that also made you gay? Is that her logic?
I'm not sure. I don't think she drew diagrams.
Okay, fair enough.
It was just in an interview.
Yeah, where she said, if
also,
you're a
you
man,
just don't want to
be
you don't want to be in a media interview citing my friend told me this about butt sex. Like, I just don't think so. But you know, it's more innocent times.
Just
people didn't have so much
17.
media.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it. I don't know if you have this, Alice, but there was a guy, a football manager called Glenn Hoddle, who in the early noughties, 90s got into this very ill-advised discussion about reincarnation. And he basically ended up implying that like people born with disabilities had probably been like evil in a past life or something. And it was just like a man who should not have been discussing. He was well out of his depth intellectually, and should have just said, you know what, I don't know what I'm talking about. But sort of ended up, and I think he got sacked as a result of it. It was it's real good evidence of just like media training, and just also the ability to say, you know what, I have no idea. So I'd encourage people to do that, maybe.
Yeah, well, I feel like the problem is when you're like a revered writer, people are looking at you like what you have to say is important, and you can lose. And it's like being really hot. I feel like I meet some really nice people who are really hot, and then I also meet some people who are really hot who no one has ever just gone, "What are you talking about?" And I feel like they're very nice people. You can tell they've got really lovely kind of a vibe. Of course they have. Everyone in the world has treated them really kindly and nicely. They have not a malicious bone in their body, and they will hold forth for like half an hour about something that is complete garbage. And you just go, oh, nobody's ever gone, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And that
yeah, exactly.
I feel we all need that in our lives, Don't you think?
Yeah, there's a real freedom in going, oh, I'm out of my depth and I am going to stop talking now. Like, it's so liberating to be able to do that. And it sort of washes away all sins as well. You say awful stuff and then go, oh, I've just realised I'm an idiot and I'm very ill-informed on this subject. So just ignore me.
And that brings us to the end of this week's episode of Realms Unknown. These are our recommendations for this week. Read The Prisoner of Zenda. It may inspire your inner fan fiction writer. Read The Dispossessed, because we should all read as much Ursula K. Le Guin as we possibly can. We should also enjoy any author who has a complicated name and the confidence to back themselves with a complicated name, And also, I mean, if you like Ursula K. Le Guin and you've read all of the Ursula K. Le Guin because you're a massive fantasy nerd and that's why you're listening to this podcast, N.K. Jemisin, also an excellent sci-fi writer. And once you've finished all of that, email me for more recommendations at realmsunknown@thebuglepodcast.com. And then also, why not look up The Fifth Element? Just enjoy that thing with the opera singer with a hole in her tummy and tell me what you think about naive hot ladies and or Brendan Fraser's. We want your opinion. Tom, have you got anything to plug?
I mentioned it last time, but I would say my big cartel, which sounds like it's organised crime, but it's not. It's just the way I sell my sort of artwork and things, a lot of which have a kind of entertainment and sci-fi and fantasy bent, do I have the URL? That'd be handy, wouldn't it? I think it's tomneenanart.bigcartel.com, and I'll be sort of throughout the year selling prints and things. I've really enjoyed that process. It's a side hustle, so I'm not there to kind of scalp people. It's just to sort of get the artwork out there, really. So why not check that out?
Do check it out, Tom. I really like your paintings. I enjoy them
Thank you so much.
immensely. And if I become wealthy, I'll buy heaps of them and build a hut out of them. And I'm on tour at the moment in the UK. Find out the details of the tour at alicefraser.com. I'm also running a writer's retreat. If you would like to go to Switzerland and work on the thing that you're working on with me around, our expression of interests are available at patreon.com/AliceFraser. If you go there, you can find the expression of interest form for my Swiss writer's retreat in Switzerland. It's not in Swiss, it's in English. I'm there. We'll have teachers, we'll have guest teachers, and we have some really good feedback from the first round of doing it. So please come along there, patreon.com/AliceFraser. It just generally, that's a one-stop shop for all of my stand-up specials, podcasts, blogs, weekly salons, and my twice-weekly writers' meetings. So if you don't want to go to Switzerland, you can just come on Zoom and write with me there. This is a Bugle podcast and Alice Fraser production. Your editor and executive producer is Chris Skinner. I'll talk to you again next week in Realms Unknown.